I hadn't planned on catfishing my own brother. That wasn't something you penciled into your calendar between dentist appointments and grocery shopping. But desperation has a way of making the unthinkable seem reasonable. You're better off without him, Lise. Trust me on this one. Mark leaned back in his chair, swirling the remainder of his whiskey with an air of satisfaction that made my stomach turn. We were sitting in my kitchen 3 days after Daniel had broken up with me, and my brother had dropped by with takeout and that particular expression I'd grown to hate, smug concern. I really liked him, I said, picking at my pad thai without appetite. 6 months of dating, the longest relationship I'd managed in years, gone because Daniel couldn't handle the family dynamic. His words, not mine. You always think you like them until you see who they really are. Mark set his glass down with authority. The guy had 3 speeding tickets in the last 5 years. Impulse control issues. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. How would you know that? Mark had the decency to hesitate, but only for a second. I have a buddy in the DMV. You ran a background check on Daniel? The noodle slipped from my fork, landing with a soft plop on the table. Not personally. I had someone look into him. It's what Dad would have done. Our father had been dead for 12 years, but Mark never tired of invoking him when justifying his interference in my life. Dad had been protective, yes, but not invasive. Not manipulative. The distinction was lost on my brother. What else did you do? I tried to keep my voice level as anger pulsed behind my temples. Mark sighed like I was being unreasonable. I might have mentioned to him that you have a history of getting too serious too quickly. And that your last boyfriend moved to Seattle partially to get some space. Jason moved for a job opportunity, I said automatically, though the old wound still stung. And Daniel broke up with me because he said my family seemed complicated. Now I understand what he meant. Look, if he bailed because of one conversation with your brother, he wasn't going to stick around anyway. I stood up, suddenly unable to remain at the table. You need to go. Lise. Now, Mark. After he left, I sat alone in my apartment feeling the familiar mixture of anger and helplessness. This wasn't the first time. There was Michael, who mysteriously received a job offer in another division of the company we both worked for after mentioning to Mark that we were discussing moving in together. And before him, Raj, who cooled things off after Mark accidentally showed him my college diary during a family dinner. Both of those times, Mark had an explanation that cast him as my protector and the men in my life as somehow flawed or unworthy, and each time I'd eventually forgiven him because he was my only close family, and because Confrontations never changed anything. I pulled out my phone and stared at Daniel's last text. I think you're amazing, Lisa, but I'm not equipped to handle the complexity that comes with you. I'm sorry. At 38, I was tired of being alone, tired of having relationships sabotaged, tired of my brother's suffocating version of love. As I poured myself another glass of wine, I opened Instagram and found myself scrolling through Mark's profile. There he was with his hiking group, at a wine tasting, at the indie film festival he'd attended instead of my book launch last year. My finger paused over a post from 3 months ago, Mark complaining about the superficial dating scene with the hashtags #still looking, #dating app sucks, #where are the substantive women. An idea began to form, terrible and perfect. Creating Catherine Miller took more preparation than I expected. I started with research, scanning the dating apps Mark had mentioned using. I noted the types of women he engaged with, the profiles he complained about to me, the qualities he claimed to value. Catherine needed to be attractive but not intimidatingly beautiful. Intellectual without being pretentious. Outdoorsy but not a fitness obsessive. I built her using an AI image generator, blending features until she looked both unique and believable, dark hair cut in a practical bob, glasses that suggested intelligence, a smile that appeared genuine but slightly reserved. For her biography, I gave her my brother's dream resume: financial analyst, he respected careers with stability, amateur photographer, a passion he wished someone would share, hiker, his weekend obsession, documentary enthusiast, his favorite conversation starter, and just enough self-deprecating humor to seem authentic without appearing insecure. I created accounts across multiple platforms, building a modest but consistent social media presence. I researched financial analysis terminology, watched countless documentaries, and studied hiking trails in our region. I set up a separate phone number and email account. I even created a spreadsheet to track my lies. The plan was simple: match with Mark, engage him in conversation, and gather evidence of his interference in my relationships. Then, once I had proof, I would confront him and demand change. It wasn't about humiliation, it was about holding up a mirror. I hadn't counted on how easily Mark would fall for Catherine, or how quickly the lines would blur. Our first exchange was on a Thursday evening. I'd carefully timed my first message to arrive when I knew Mark would be home alone watching his weekly documentary. "Catherine, that Attenborough series you mentioned in your profile? Just started it. The deep-sea episode is blowing my mind." His response came within minutes. "Mark, finally, someone who appreciates the important things. Most people I match with want to talk about reality TV. What's your favorite documentary of all time?" Tough question, I know. I smiled, recognizing my brother's standard conversation opener. He'd asked me the same question about books, movies, and bands countless times. "Catherine, Jiro dreams of sushi." Simple subject, perfect execution. Or maybe the act of killing for sheer emotional impact. You? As Catherine, I gave answers that were thoughtful but not identical to Mark's opinions. I knew he respected people who challenged him, within reason. Over the next few weeks, our conversations developed a rhythm. Catherine was interested but never desperate, engaged but occasionally busy with her demanding career. I kept detailed notes of everything we discussed, building a consistent character who was, essentially, the female version of my brother with just enough differences to be intriguing. "Mark, ever notice how everyone claims to love hiking but they mean walking on a flat trail for 20 minutes? Catherine, guilty of using hiking photos from that one time I climbed halfway up Mount Rainier as my header images, but I'm trying to get back into it. Any trail recommendations that won't completely destroy someone getting back in shape?" I knew exactly which moderate trails Mark would suggest, the same ones he'd tried to get me to hike for years. The deception should have been difficult, but it wasn't. Years of navigating Mark's moods and opinions had trained me well. I knew which topics energized him, which philosophical questions he enjoyed debating, which jokes landed. As Catherine, I was the perfect audience for his thoughts on everything from investment strategies to foreign films. By the 6-week mark, we were texting daily. Catherine became Mark's confidant, the person he messaged first thing in the morning and last thing at night. I learned things about my brother I'd never known: his insecurities about aging, his fear that his career had plateaued, his regrets about a college girlfriend he'd treated poorly, and then, inevitably, he began talking about me. "Mark, my sister started seeing someone new. Already worried she's rushing into things." "Catherine, you two must be close for you to be so concerned." "Mark, someone has to look out for her. Our parents are gone, and she doesn't always see people clearly." "Catherine, what do you mean?" "Mark, she's brilliant with her art but naive with people. Trusts too easily. Gets hurt." I read his words with a strange detachment. Was that really how he saw me? As some helpless creature needing protection from her own poor judgment? "Catherine, it's sweet that you care so much. What does she think about your involvement?" "Mark, she gets frustrated sometimes. Doesn't always see I'm helping her avoid mistakes." "Catherine, like what?" "Mark, her last boyfriend had some financial problems he was hiding. The one before that had anger issues. I help her see these things before she gets too invested." I nearly dropped my phone. Raj had been between jobs when we'd met, but he'd been transparent about it. And Michael had raised his voice exactly once during an argument about Mark's constant presence in our lives. As the weeks passed, Mark revealed more about his protective actions, casual background checks, accidental meetings with my boyfriends without me present, and subtle undermining comments that I'd never heard but that had clearly registered with the men in my life. The most damning revelation came 2 months into our fictional relationship, after I'd mentioned running into Daniel at a coffee shop. "Mark, my sister's ex wanted to talk to her today." Thankfully she just kept it brief. "Catherine, why thankfully? Maybe they have unresolved issues to discuss?" "Mark, trust me, they're better apart." "Had to intervene there." "Catherine, intervene how?" "Mark, nothing major. Had a colleague look into his background. Guy had some financial issues, parking violations, nothing criminal but showed a pattern. Shared my concerns with him man to man." "Catherine, how did he respond?" "Mark, he got defensive, claimed I was overstepping. But he ended things with Lisa afterward, so I think he knew I was right." My hand shook as I took screenshots of the conversation. This was the confession I'd been waiting for, but it felt hollow. I'd known Mark was responsible for my breakup with Daniel, but seeing him boast about it to a woman he was trying to impress made me feel physically ill. Yet I continued the charade, methodically collecting evidence while building Mark's trust in Catherine. I told myself it was necessary, that this was the only way to make him understand the damage he was causing. In reality, part of me enjoyed the power of knowing what Mark didn't, that his perfect woman was an elaborate fiction created by the sister he underestimated. As our online relationship intensified, Mark began pushing to meet in person. I deflected with business trips and family obligations, but by the 3rd month, his patience was wearing thin. "Mark, beginning to think you're a catfish." 3 months of great conversation but always an excuse not to meet. It was time to end the game. I suggested dinner at Corsica, an upscale restaurant downtown with private dining rooms. When Mark accepted, I immediately made a reservation. "Catherine, table for 2 under Miller, 8 p.m. Friday. Looking forward to finally meeting." "Mark, I'll be the one trying not to look nervous." That made 2 of us. I arrived at Corsica an hour early, having paid extra for the private dining room and the staff's discretion. I arranged the evidence carefully on the table, printed screenshots of our conversations, copies of texts between Daniel and me before and after Mark's interference, and photographs of other relationships Mark had sabotaged. As 8 o'clock approached, I took several deep breaths, fighting the urge to flee. What I was about to do felt both necessary and terrible. I checked my phone one last time and saw Mark had messaged Catherine. "Mark, just parking. Brought flowers." "Too much?" I didn't respond. His message to me as his sister came moments later. "Mark, meeting a friend for dinner. Don't wait up if you wanted to hang out later." Another lie. I placed the phone face down beside the evidence and waited. At precisely 8:03, I heard my brother's voice outside the private room, politely asking the host about the Miller reservation. The door opened, and there he stood, bouquet in hand, his expression shifting from anticipation to confusion to shock as he registered my presence. "Lisa? What are you doing here?" His eyes darted around the room as if Catherine might materialize from behind a curtain. "I'm meeting someone." "No, you're not." My voice was steadier than I expected. "Catherine Miller doesn't exist, Mark." He stared at me, the flowers slowly lowering to his side. "What are you talking about?" "Catherine is me. I created her." I gestured to the chair across from me. "You should sit down." He remained standing, his face cycling through emotions, disbelief, embarrassment, anger. "This is some kind of joke." "It's not a joke. Please, sit." Slowly, he approached the table, his eyes falling on the array of printed conversations. He sank into the chair, the flowers dropping onto the table. "Why would you do this?" His voice was barely audible. "Because you gave me no choice." I pushed the screenshots toward him. "You've been systematically destroying my relationships for years, and every time I confronted you, you dismissed my concerns." "I was protecting you." "No." I cut him off. "You were controlling me. And when I tried to tell you how your protection was hurting me, you wouldn't listen, so I created someone you would listen to." Mark picked up one of the papers, seeing his own words about Daniel, about how he deliberately interfered. His face flushed. You manipulated me. Yes, I admitted. I did exactly what you've been doing to me for years. How does it feel to have someone else controlling your relationships? To have someone decide what information you get, who you can trust? This isn't the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. I pushed another set of screenshots toward him. Here's where you told Catherine about investigating Daniel's parking tickets. Here's where you bragged about how you convinced Jason that taking the Seattle job would be better for both of us. Here's where you admitted to showing Raj my college diary. Mark fell silent, scanning the evidence of his interference. I've spent years watching you sabotage my chances at happiness because you decided I couldn't make my own choices. My voice finally cracked. Do you know what that's like? To be 38 years old and have your brother treat you like a child incapable of managing her own life? I never thought of it that way, he said quietly. After Mom and Dad died, I promised I'd look out for you. Looking out for me would mean supporting my choices, not undermining them. It would mean respecting me enough to make my own mistakes. Mark stared at the scattered papers, the reality of his behavior laid bare. I thought I was helping. You weren't. I took a deep breath. I'm moving to Portland next month. His head snapped up. What? Since when? I was offered a position curating for a gallery there. I accepted last week. This wasn't part of the plan, the job offer had come unexpectedly, but sitting across from Mark now, I knew it was the right decision. I need space, Mark. I need to build a life without your constant interference. You're leaving because of me. It wasn't a question. I'm leaving because I need to. But whether our relationship survives depends on you. I slid an envelope across the table. This is the name of a therapist who specializes in family dynamics and control issues. I paid for 10 sessions. Mark stared at the envelope without touching it. Therapy? You think I need therapy because I care about my sister? I think you need therapy because you can't tell the difference between caring and controlling. I gathered the papers into a neat pile. And until you can, I need distance. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 12 years of manipulation hanging between us. Finally, Mark picked up the envelope. What about Daniel? He asked. Did you tell him about this? Not yet. But I will. I stood up, suddenly exhausted. The reservation is paid for. Stay and eat if you want. As I reached the door, Mark called out, Lisa, wait. I turned back. I never meant to hurt you. I really thought I was protecting you. I looked at my brother, brilliant, misguided, and suddenly smaller than I'd ever seen him. I know you believe that. That's why you need help. I left him sitting alone in the private dining room, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal and the wilting flowers he'd brought for a woman who didn't exist. 3 months later, I was settling into my apartment in Portland when my phone chimed with a text from Mark. Mark, just finished session 8. Dr. Levine says hello. It was followed by a photo, Mark sitting in what was clearly a therapist's office, giving a thumbs up that looked only slightly forced. I smiled despite myself and typed a response. Lisa, proud of you. How's it going? Mark, hard. Good hard, though. Learning a lot about why I needed to control things. Dad stuff, mostly. Lisa, that makes sense. Mark, how's Portland? Lisa, rainy. Beautiful. The gallery job is everything I hoped for. There was a pause before his next message appeared. Mark, I owe you an apology. Many apologies. Starting with Daniel. My heart skipped. Daniel and I had spoken once since I'd moved, a careful conversation where I'd explained Mark's interference and my drastic response to it. He'd been understandably wary but hadn't completely shut the door. Lisa, what about Daniel? Mark, I called him last week. Told him everything. That I lied about the background check, that I deliberately tried to make him think you had issues. Told him you deserved better than what I did. I stared at the screen, tears pricking at my eyes. This was more than I'd hoped for. Lisa, what did he say? Mark, that I'm an asshole. He's not wrong. But he also asked for your new number. I hope that's okay. Gave it to him yesterday. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. Lisa, thanks for telling me. I need to take this call. Mark, good luck. And Lisa? I'm sorry. For everything. I set the phone down, taking a moment to breathe before answering Daniel's call. Mark's interference had cost me relationships, trust, and time. His apology couldn't undo that damage overnight. But it was a start. The phone continued to ring as I thought about the lies I'd told as Catherine, the manipulation I'd employed to expose Mark's manipulation. I wasn't proud of it, but I couldn't regret it either. Sometimes, the only way to break destructive patterns was to disrupt them completely. I picked up the phone. Hello, Daniel, I said. It's been a while. On the other end of the line, he cleared his throat. I got a strange call from your brother. I imagine you did. I smiled sadly. It's a long story. I've got time, he said. If you do. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of Mark's interference lifting. Whatever happened with Daniel, whether we reconnected or simply found closure, it would be our choice. Our relationship to navigate without my brother's invisible hand tilting the scales. Yes, I said, watching the Portland rain trace patterns on my window. I've got time. Please like and subscribe if you would like more great revenge stories like this one. How about you? Could you catfish your own sibling? Think you'd get away with it, or do you think you'd crack under the pressure? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.